Forget Florence, forget Paris. After the Second World War, the center of the art world was here in New York. Up till now, American art hadn't been taken very seriously. Culture only flowed one way across the Atlantic. But from the 1940s, America became a source of inspiration for a group of artists who would become the New York School. They started to paint big, really big, and people found them baffling. It takes time, but if you'll just wait on and refuse to be off-put, you'll find these paintings surprisingly rewarding. And the pioneer of all this was the man from the Wild West, Jackson Pollock. He painted his paintings, if you can use the word painted, in a completely new way. He didn't even use a paintbrush. He dribbled and dripped his paint onto the canvas. But not randomly, with complete control. This is Jackson Pollock's great Lavender Mist, and it is great, physically too. To see it, you have to come so close that in a way you can't see it. There's no image you can stand at a distance from and take in. You've got to come right up and move around it. And of course, it suddenly dawned upon me, that's exactly what Jackson Pollock wanted, because that's how he painted it. Not on an easel, but there on the floor, and he moved around it himself. In every other painting, the way it was painted has disappeared into the final product. You can see something, perhaps, but all the artist did, the way he walked backwards and forwards, the way he used his brush, all that's gone forever. In this painting, it's all preserved. Every movement, every idea that occurred to him, that little spot of brown over there, for example, or the way you've got these long slashes of black, all of this is forever there, a record of creativity, white-hot creativity. And for somebody like myself who's completely uncreative, it's awesome to be so close to the actual making of something beautiful. Dripping paint turned Pollock into a celebrity. He was even filmed in the surrounds of his studio, leaving us this unique record of an artist at work. But he was a tough, macho alcoholic whose greatest, most sensitive paintings were only created when he was sober. Watching Pollock dancing around his canvas is an enthralling experience. Yes, but it's a heartrending one when you realize that making this film started him again on his suicidal drinking habits. He was a very private man, Pollock, and letting all this be seen must somehow have seemed to him a betrayal. He was off the wagon, then he jumped straight back on again, and it all ended with driving into a tree and killing himself. Pollock died when he was only 44, and he passed into legend, almost a benchmark against which other artists must measure themselves. one was an illegal immigrant from Holland who'd been so desperate to reach America that he stowed away on a steamboat and jumped ship in New York. His name was Willem de Kooning. His only luggage was the training and traditions of a European art school. De Kooning loved the grit and grime of New York. He lived with an arty clique in New York Soho, and he didn't just talk about art, he fought about it. And he fought for it, because these artists, abstract, expressionist, found it very hard to survive. Their work was talked about, but nobody really bought it. Say de Kooning, and most people immediately think of his women, and they think in Technicolor, because these are extraordinary images. One critic has said they were painted in a rage of lust and hatred. And another has said, absolute nonsense, they're a celebration of the flesh. In fact, they remind him of Rubens. And a third, and I'm not making this up, said they're self-portraits. And de Kooning, rather glad to get off the feminist hook, said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, there was a lot of the feminine in him. 2 women in the country. You can't actually see much of the country because they block it out. And I always feel that this blank bit at the bottom is because de Kooning really gave up on the country, knowing that these blondes would insist on standing in front of it, whatever he painted. Huge creatures with their great balloons of pneumatic mountains of breasts, their fleshy arms like legs of mutton, those great thighs which come down to those teeny-weeny little high-heeled shoes, and the smile, because they stand there twinkling at us, absolutely convinced they're irresistible. Yeah, poor sweeties, because they're horrible. They're so comic. And yet, like all great comedy, there's just this element of pathos. But while making up your mind what you think of them, don't forget to notice how they're painted. Because they're painted in what looks like a wild frenzy of color and shape. The whole canvas is alive with energy and vitality, out of which, miraculously, these creatures coalesce. It is and remains astonishing. But American art of the 50s wasn't all wild emotion and frenzy. There was stillness. There was mystical calm, and this is what we get from the third giant of the New York school, Mark Rothko. In Rothko, color is everything. No movement, no figures, often not even a title to stand between you and the paint. Rothko was a typical melting pot American whose family had to flee from Russia while he was still a child, a neurotic, driven man who found his stability in painting. I'm not afraid that you won't think this Mark Rothko beautiful, but what I am afraid, a little, is that somebody might think it's just beautiful. Lovely colors, no meaning. Because meaning was what he was all about, and he would have been furiously angry if anyone thought that, and told you so in suitably salty language. It was subject matter that mattered to him, and the subject matter was the emotions. Not small personal emotions, up today, down tomorrow, but the great timeless emotions. How we feel about death and courage and ecstasy. And he was convinced that if you would just encounter his painting, that emotion will be communicated to you with absolute clarity. So to achieve this, he painted very large. Because in a small painting, big U, little painting, you can control it. But with a large painting, it controls you. You're taken into it. Unless, of course, you look at it from a distance, that killing, assessing look. So to combat that, he insisted that always the lights were very dim. So you couldn't actually see the thing until you were right up against it. And then something does begin to happen. He painted with very, very thin mists of paint, feathering it on, breathing it on. And you are taken up out of yourself into something greater, something transcendent and majestic. If you could think of a religious painting without religion, this is what you experience here. It's so timeless that when I've had this encounter, I feel to return to the world of time, I have to shake my head and bring myself down to earth again. The New York school, and here's a lovely irony, were not at all interested in New York. They looked within, they sought inspiration. But there were other artists who thought that abstract art was sheer pretension, absolute bunk. They wanted to make art out of Coke bottles, commercials, comic books, all the unromantic objects of their real lives. They were interested not in what they felt, but in what they saw and did. And it was called pop art. In pop art, the epic was replaced with the everyday, and the mass-produced awarded the same significance as the unique. The gulf between high art and low art was eroding. And the quintessential pop artist was Andy Warhol, who adopted the silkscreen to mass-produce his paintings. His studio became known as the factory, where the work was executed with a casualness and a crudeness which infuriated the purists. They soon learnt that no image was too sacrosanct for Warhol. Andy Warhol, great artist or con artist? Now the jury's still out on this one. Angrily out. Whether for good or ill, Warhol changed the story of painting. And how can you do that if you're not a powerful artist? And you're a powerful artist if you create from your own truth. But the fascinating thing about Warhol was he didn't feel he had a separate truth. He felt he was just like everybody else. And what interests everybody? Well, look at the newspapers. Glamour, sex, disaster. I so wish he'd known Princess Di. But he did the best he could with Marilyn Monroe, the most famous woman in the world, and she committed suicide. All America was engrossed, and so was Warhol. And from that engrossment, he painted picture after picture of her. He wanted to show that if you're a great celebrity, your image is up for grabs. People can do what they want with you. You become a sort of nobody if you're a celebrity, which is a very subtle insight. And then the whole tragedy of going from brightness into darkness, from life into the forgottenness of death. And then he deals with this question of repetition, which is so common in everybody's life, monotony. every one of these identical publicity shots of Marilyn is different. The boring can be absorbing. And so I must admit that in a strange, weird, back-to-front sort of way, I find Andy Warhol an awesome artist. Warhol alerted the public to what they were missing. There was a whole world there that art was ignoring. Jasper Johns made art out of a map. He used subjects that, as he put it, people saw but nobody looked at. He used again and again the image of the American flag to focus attention not on the image itself, but on the way he'd painted it. He'd collaged a board with newspaper and covered it not only with paint but with wax, because that showed every mark, every drip, every movement of his brush. And what he really wants to communicate is an idea. Is this a flag, or is it a work of art, a concept? Now, this conceptual art is very popular at the moment, popular with the art world, not with the rest of us. And often you see the stuff, you get the concept, and then you move on, you've lost interest. So here's another question. When is conceptual art great art? And the answer is when it gives deep visual satisfaction, like Jasper Johns' flag. The work of Jasper Johns is completely impersonal, pared right down, and I think he's been a strong influence on the minimalist artists of our century. If abstract art dominated the 40s and 50s, minimalism, along with pop art, belonged to the 60s. Minimalism is what it sounds like, an art that reduces itself to the absolute minimum. It's an attempt to take the ego out of the painting. It isn't possible, but it's a noble endeavor to create a pure art, a contemplative art that forces you just to look. It all started with Frank Stella, but my favorite minimalist artist is of a different gender and a different temperament. Agnes Martin is a mystic, happy to jettison color and the sense of depth and leave just these subtle lines of pencil across the canvas. She says that when people look at the ocean, they can look at it all day, and that's what she's trying to capture. She's not painting nature, but the feeling of being in nature. Always the same, yet always different. I've tried again and again to share with people my very deep love for Agnes Martin. And each time I fail, I've tried to excuse myself by saying she doesn't reproduce it. It's too delicate. And this particular picture hangs in the office of a top New York executive. And it's here because his wife loved it, and his architect loved it, and he hated it. He thought it was the dullest picture he'd ever seen. And then, forced to look at it, slowly it began to work upon him. And he began to love it because it communicates such serenity, such joy. Agnes Martin is always trying to create from the things that matter most in life, the things that will last. Business pressures, all the troubles we live in, those things will pass, but joy and peace and truth will remain. She said that she wants the experience of looking at her paintings to be one of beauty, happiness, and innocence. And if you look long enough, happiness happens. New York had been the center of the story of painting since the war. But after the explosion of pop art and the growth of minimalism, some people said that painting was dead. But of course, that's absolute rubbish. It may be fighting for survival, but it's very much still there. And in the 70s, Europe re-established its dominion with a classical tradition, which of course had never disappeared. I can imagine someone who's been bewildered by contemporary art, settling back now and saying, this is more like it. The artist and his model by Balthus, and we're right to be impressed. I think he's the greatest European painter of our times. Now, it's much more complex than it appears, because he's very gently rebuffing his critics, who thought there was something perverse about his great interest in that moment when a child becomes an adolescent. He's saying, not at all. There's the artist, there's the model, and what does he look at? The light. And that whole body of his is just stilts to support that great painting hand and the face looking into the light. And the model, she's not interested in him either. She's a typical Balthus girl. She's a child sprawled there with her big smock and her comic or whatever it is. But look at her face. It's a Mona Lisa face. It has that wonderful, enigmatic, wandering beauty, and you feel that under that great tent, her body is changing. It's a picture full of order. Even the apples, even the box. Clothes hang over the chairs with casual dignity. And I think it's that order and that dignity that reminds us of the old masters. And because both the human beings are self-engrossed and not communicating, there's a sadness. And that, alas, reminds us of our own times. Although it's difficult to know which contemporary names will stand the test of time, there are some of whom we can say this with a degree of certainty. Francis Bacon was a strange, maverick figure, untaught, just guided by an inner necessity to paint. He produced these extraordinary, dark and haunting images. You can't possibly like Bacon, but what he's doing is important. In his Screaming Popes, he refers to Velasquez's great pope holding on to the arms of his chair. But Bacon's post-Holocaust pope is screaming in agony. It's an image of power and pain and imprisonment, a great protest against the unfairness of life. Other painters of the London School have continued his struggle. Working with a deep love of the texture of paint, they use the tools of the old masters, but with 20th century minds and 20th century experiences. And as we approach the end of this millennium, for once British artists are right up there with the best in the story of painting. One of the foremost is Lucian Freud, widely regarded as our greatest living painter. When an artist paints a self-portrait, he makes himself very vulnerable. And Lucian Freud has gone even further. He paints himself naked. And yet, and this is why this is such an intriguing painting, in some ways it's not a self-portrait at all. He's deflected our attention away from Lucian Freud and what he's like, and onto what he does. He's a painter, and he calls it painter working reflection. And of course, what the painter's working at is painting his reflection, which makes it a self-portrait. But there are two levels here. This is the real Lucian Freud, age 71. Aging and sagging, standing there in his studio with his palette knife and his palette as if they were weapons and shield. And we remember that now for the first time, painting has to battle with the world, because painting is no longer valued. But he's not really looking out at the world to battle, he's looking in at himself. And here's the other level, because every painter has always had to battle with himself, with his own dishonesty and laziness to try and create the truth. And Freud seems to be looking down at his feet. And again, two levels. His own clumsy painting shoes. And on another level, every artist's painting shoes. We can imagine Van Gogh and Rembrandt and Michelangelo and Giotto, their shoes. Every painter stands firm on the grounds of his own reality. And of course we want to know, how does the battle end? How does the story end? But of course we're in the story. The story of painting will only end when the world ends, because it's part of being human. Our ancestors in the caves painted. A child is born with this innate ability to create. So it can't end. And the end of our own story of painting, yours and mine, has to be continued.